Deep in the jungles of South Vietnam, where the thick canopy blocked out the sun and the air hung heavy with moisture, a different kind of war was being fought. This wasn't the massive tank battles of World War II or the trench warfare of World War I. This was something entirely new, something that would challenge everything the American military thought they knew about warfare. It was October 1965, and Captain Donald Robinson of the 1st ARVN Regiment found himself walking into what he thought was just another routine patrol. He had no idea he was about to become part of one of the most controversial chapters in American military history. The Vietnam War had been escalating for years, but by 1964, something fundamental had changed. The United States wasn't just sending advisors anymore. They were sending an entirely new breed of soldier, men who wore Green Berets instead of standard helmets, who spoke local languages, and who fought alongside Indigenous fighters deep in enemy territory. These were the Army Special Forces, and their mission was unlike anything the American military had ever attempted before. President John F. Kennedy had a vision that would reshape American military doctrine forever. In April 1962, he visited Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to witness a demonstration of these elite soldiers. What he saw convinced him that the future of warfare lay not in massive conventional armies, but in small, highly trained units that could adapt to local conditions and work with indigenous populations. Kennedy personally authorized the Green Beret as the official headgear of Army Special Forces, telling them they were a symbol of excellence, a badge of courage, a mark of distinction in the fight for freedom. The origins of this revolutionary approach traced back to the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, where American operatives had worked behind enemy lines with resistance fighters in occupied Europe. But Vietnam presented challenges that were exponentially more complex. The cultural barriers were immense, the terrain was hostile beyond anything American forces had previously encountered, and the enemy employed tactics that conventional military doctrine was unprepared to counter. To understand what made the Special Forces so revolutionary, you have to understand what Vietnam looked like in the early 1960s. The country was split along the 17th parallel, with North Vietnam under communist control and South Vietnam struggling to maintain its independence. But the real war wasn't being fought along that neat dividing line. It was being fought in the villages, in the mountains, in the rice paddies, and especially among the ethnic minorities who lived in the remote highlands. The Montagnards, as the French had called them, were the indigenous peoples of the Central Highlands. These tribes, the Rade, the Jarai, the Banar, the Coho, the Minong, the Sedang, the Bru, and dozens of smaller groups, had been living in these mountains for over 1,000 years. Each tribe had its own distinct language, customs, and territorial boundaries. They practiced slash-and-burn agriculture, lived in traditional longhouses raised on stilts, and maintained animist religious beliefs that centered around the worship of ancestral spirits and forest deities. Their society was structured around village councils led by respected elders, with decisions made through lengthy consensus-building processes that could take days to resolve even simple matters. They had no written languages, no centralized government, and no experience with modern technology. Yet their geographic location made them strategically crucial to the outcome of the war in Southeast Asia. The Central Highlands controlled the primary infiltration routes between North and South Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex network of footpaths and truck routes that wound through Laos and Cambodia before entering South Vietnam, passed directly through tribal territories. Whoever controlled these areas could monitor and disrupt enemy supply lines, or conversely provide safe passage for communist forces moving south to support the insurgency. This is where the Special Forces came in. In November 1961, the Army launched what would become known as the CIDG Program, the Civilian Irregular Defense Group. The concept was deceptively simple, but operationally complex. American Special Forces soldiers would establish camps in remote tribal areas, train local fighters to defend their villages against communist infiltration, and create an intelligence network that could monitor enemy movement throughout the region. The men chosen for this mission underwent the most rigorous selection and training process in the American military. The Special Forces Qualification Course, known as the Q Course, lasted over 6 months and had a failure rate exceeding 60%. Candidates had to master foreign languages, advanced medical procedures, demolitions, communications, and unconventional warfare tactics. But perhaps most importantly, they had to demonstrate the psychological flexibility necessary to work effectively with people whose cultural background was completely different from their own. Staff Sergeant Barry Sadler, who would later become famous for writing The Ballad of the Green Berets, was typical of these early Special Forces soldiers. Before joining the military, he had been a musician and songwriter, experiences that gave him insights into human nature and communication that proved valuable in working with tribal populations. His ability to connect with people from different backgrounds, combined with his military training, made him an effective bridge between American military objectives and tribal concerns. The first CIDG camp was established at Buen-Anau in Darlac Province in February 1962. The camp was built in traditional raid territory, and the local tribal chief, E-Pom Enuel, became the first Montagnard leader to formally ally with American forces. The success of this initial experiment led to rapid expansion of the program throughout the Central Highlands. Building these camps required solving logistical problems that had never been encountered in conventional warfare. Everything had to be transported by helicopter through some of the most challenging flying conditions in the world. The Central Highlands were subject to sudden weather changes that could ground aircraft for days. Monsoon rains turned landing zones into muddy quagmires, while mountain winds created dangerous downdrafts that had already claimed several helicopters. Each camp required tons of construction materials, weapons, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and communications equipment. The CH-21 Shawnee helicopters used in the early years of the program could carry less than 2 tons of cargo, meaning that establishing a single camp required dozens of flights over terrain controlled by hostile forces. Pilots had to navigate through mountain valleys where a single engine failure would mean almost certain death, landing at crude airstrips carved out of jungle clearings while under potential enemy observation. Captain Walter Conway commanded the team that established Camp Ben Het near the Cambodian border in 1963. The location was chosen specifically because it sat astride one of the main infiltration routes used by North Vietnamese forces, but its remote position also made it one of the most vulnerable installations in South Vietnam. Conway's team had to build defensive positions, living quarters, and communications facilities, while simultaneously training local tribal fighters and conducting reconnaissance missions into Cambodia. The defensive design of Special Forces camps reflected hard-learned lessons about jungle warfare. Traditional military fortifications were designed for open terrain, where enemies approached across visible ground. In the jungle, attacks could come from any direction, often without warning, and enemy forces could approach to within meters of defensive positions before being detected. Special Forces camps were built as concentric defensive rings with multiple fallback positions and overlapping fields of fire designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined kill zones. The outer perimeter typically consisted of multiple rows of concertina wire, punji stake pits filled with sharpened bamboo spears, and carefully placed obstacles designed to slow attacking forces while exposing them to defensive fire. Claymore mines were positioned to cover likely approach routes, while mortar positions provided indirect fire support that could reach any point around the camp perimeter. The inner perimeter included bunkers constructed with multiple layers of sandbags and overhead cover designed to withstand direct hits from rockets and mortars. Living conditions in these remote camps were primitive by any standard. Soldiers slept in bunkers that were hot, humid, and infested with insects during the day, then cold and damp during the brief mountain nights.
Fresh food was almost non-existent except for occasional helicopter deliveries, and the standard diet consisted of military rations supplemented by whatever could be obtained locally. Water had to be purified with chemical tablets that left an unpleasant taste, and bathing facilities consisted of whatever streams or rivers were available near the camp.
Medical care presented constant challenges that went far beyond treating combat wounds. Tropical diseases were endemic throughout the region. Malaria was transmitted by mosquitoes that were active around the clock, requiring soldiers to take daily prophylactic medication that often caused nausea and other side effects. Dysentery and other intestinal diseases were common when soldiers had to drink water from local sources during extended operations away from camp. Skin infections thrived in the constantly humid conditions, and minor cuts could become serious problems when they failed to heal properly. The tribal fighters trained by special forces brought unique capabilities that conventional military units lacked, but they also presented challenges that required completely different approaches to leadership and training. Most had been hunters and farmers before joining the CIDG program, giving them intimate knowledge of local terrain and exceptional skills at moving silently through dense vegetation. They could track enemy forces across seemingly solid rock, identify which direction enemies had traveled by examining broken twigs and disturbed earth, and predict weather changes by observing animal behavior and atmospheric conditions. But they had no experience with modern military equipment or tactics. Concepts like radio discipline, fire and maneuver, and coordinated operations had to be taught from the ground up. Many had never worn boots, used watches, or operated mechanical equipment more complex than simple farm tools. Teaching them to maintain and operate M16 rifles, PRC-25 radios, and other standard military equipment required patience and instructional techniques that weren't covered in any military manual. Language barriers created constant operational challenges. The Rade language had no words for many military concepts that Americans considered basic. Terms like flanking movement, supporting fire, and tactical withdrawal had no direct translations, requiring instructors to invent new terminology or use elaborate explanations that might be misunderstood in combat situations. Time concepts were particularly difficult to communicate, since tribal societies typically measured time by natural phenomena rather than precise schedules. Cultural differences went far beyond language. Traditional Montagnard society was built around consensus decision-making processes that could take hours or days to reach conclusions. American military doctrine emphasized rapid decision-making and immediate execution of orders, creating fundamental conflicts between leadership styles. Tribal chiefs expected to be consulted about all decisions affecting their fighters, while American commanders needed the authority to make tactical decisions quickly in response to changing battlefield conditions. Religious beliefs created additional complexities that American soldiers had to learn to navigate carefully. Many tribal groups believed that certain areas of the forest were inhabited by spirits and should not be disturbed. Some considered it unlucky to begin operations on certain days or during particular phases of the moon. Traditional ceremonies and festivals took precedence over military schedules, and attempting to override these cultural obligations could destroy the trust relationships that made effective cooperation possible. The enemy forces faced by CIDG camps were professional soldiers who had been fighting in Southeast Asian jungles for over a decade. North Vietnamese Army regulars had gained extensive experience fighting French forces during the First Indochina War, learning tactics specifically adapted to jungle terrain and guerrilla warfare. They understood how to use the natural advantages provided by dense vegetation, difficult terrain, and familiar territory to offset American advantages in firepower and technology. Viet Cong local forces included many fighters who had grown up in the same villages and forests where they now operated. They knew every trail, every water source, every hiding place within their operational areas.
They could move through terrain that would challenge experienced American soldiers, and they had extensive networks of supporters who provided intelligence, supplies, and safe havens. Many had fought against the French and understood both conventional and guerrilla warfare tactics. The weapons used by enemy forces were selected specifically for jungle conditions. AK-47 assault rifles were more reliable than M16s in humid, muddy conditions where mechanical failures could be fatal. RPG-7 rocket-propelled grenades were effective against bunkers and defensive positions while being light enough for individual soldiers to carry and operate. Mortars could be broken down into components light enough for soldiers to carry through dense terrain, then quickly assembled to provide indirect fire support.
Enemy tactics emphasized mobility, surprise, and the ability to concentrate superior forces at decisive points before disappearing back into the jungle. They would spend weeks observing a target, learning the routines of the defenders, identifying weaknesses in defensive positions, and planning attack routes that would avoid the strongest defensive positions. When they attacked, it was typically at night or during periods of limited visibility, using their intimate knowledge of local terrain to achieve surprise. Intelligence gathering became one of the most critical and dangerous aspects of Special Forces operations. Project Delta, established in 1964 under the command of Major Charlie Beckwith, specialized in long-range reconnaissance missions deep behind enemy lines. Delta teams combined American Special Forces soldiers with carefully selected indigenous fighters to create small, highly mobile reconnaissance units. Beckwith had studied British Special Air Service tactics during an exchange assignment in England, learning techniques for operating in small teams behind enemy lines that weren't part of standard American military doctrine. He adapted these methods to Vietnam conditions, creating teams that could infiltrate enemy territory, establish observation posts, and gather intelligence about enemy movements, supply routes, and base camps. The selection process for Project Delta was extraordinarily demanding. Volunteers had to pass physical fitness tests that exceeded normal Special Forces standards, demonstrate proficiency with a wide variety of weapons and equipment, and show the mental resilience necessary to operate alone in hostile territory for extended periods. They received additional training in survival techniques, escape and evasion tactics, advanced communications procedures, and the use of specialized equipment designed for long-range reconnaissance. Delta missions typically lasted between 5 and 14 days, during which teams would operate completely alone in areas known to be controlled by enemy forces. They carried everything they needed on their backs: weapons, ammunition, food, water, communications equipment, and medical supplies. Resupply was impossible, and missing a scheduled extraction could mean being stranded in enemy territory with no way to call for help. The psychological demands of these operations were severe. Team members had to maintain absolute noise discipline while moving through terrain where the slightest sound could alert enemy forces to their presence. They had to remain motionless for hours at a time while observing enemy installations, knowing that any movement might be detected. Radio transmissions had to be brief and coded to avoid interception, and teams often operated under radio silence for days at a time. Navigation through unmarked jungle terrain required skills that went beyond normal military training. Teams used specialized equipment, including prismatic compasses, pace counters, and detailed topographic maps, but they also had to learn to navigate by reading natural signs, the direction of stream flow, changes in vegetation, and subtle differences in terrain that weren't visible on maps. Getting lost could be fatal when operating in areas where any local civilian might be an enemy informant. The Battle of Plei in October 1965 demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of Special Forces operations in Vietnam. The camp was located in Pleiku Province, near the Cambodian border, positioned to monitor one of the main infiltration routes used by North Vietnamese forces moving south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
The camp was defended by 12 American Special Forces soldiers and approximately 400 CIDG fighters, mostly Jarai tribesmen who had been recruited from local villages.
On October 19th, intelligence reports indicated that large enemy forces were moving in the area around Plei. These weren't local guerrillas or small infiltration groups, but regular North Vietnamese army units equipped with heavy weapons and supported by extensive logistics networks. The 33rd NVA Regiment, supported by elements of the 32nd Regiment, had been assigned to eliminate the Special Forces camp as part of a larger offensive designed to cut South Vietnam in half along a line running from the Cambodian border to the South China Sea. The attack began at 5:30 p.m. on October 19th with a coordinated mortar and rocket barrage that targeted the camp's communications center, ammunition storage areas, and defensive positions. The accuracy of this initial bombardment indicated that enemy forces had conducted extensive reconnaissance and knew the exact layout of the camp's defenses. This was followed by ground attacks against multiple points on the perimeter, designed to identify weak points and draw defenders away from the main assault. Captain Harold Moore, the camp commander, had prepared his defenses well. The Jarai fighters had constructed multiple defensive positions connected by covered trenches, allowing them to move between positions while remaining protected from enemy fire. Mortar crews were positioned in heavily reinforced bunkers with pre-registered firing data for all likely approach routes. Communications equipment had been distributed among several locations to ensure that contact with higher headquarters could be maintained even if the main radio post was destroyed. The fighting continued throughout the night, with enemy forces making repeated attempts to penetrate the defensive perimeter. The NVA tactics were sophisticated, combining direct assault with suppressive fire and attempts to infiltrate individual soldiers through gaps in the defensive positions. They used Bangalore torpedoes to blow holes in the wire obstacles, followed by assault teams equipped with satchel charges designed to destroy bunkers and fighting positions. The Jarai fighters proved their courage and effectiveness during this battle, holding their positions under intense pressure while maintaining discipline and coordination with their American advisors. Many had family members in nearby villages who would face certain reprisals if the camp fell to communist forces, providing additional motivation to fight effectively. Their intimate knowledge of local terrain allowed them to predict likely enemy approach routes and position defensive fires where they would be most effective. Air support played a crucial role in the defense of Plei. Forward air controllers worked throughout the night to coordinate strikes by fighter bombers and helicopter gunships, but the close proximity of friendly and enemy forces made accurate targeting extremely difficult. Pilots had to rely on radio guidance from ground controllers who were themselves under fire, dropping ordnance within hundreds of meters of friendly positions while enemy forces attempted to overrun the defensive perimeter. By dawn on October 20th, the immediate threat to the camp had been repelled, but intelligence indicated that enemy forces were regrouping for another attack. The ammunition supply was running low, several defensive positions had been damaged or destroyed, and medical supplies were needed to treat wounded defenders. Most critically, the camp's water supply had been contaminated by enemy fire, creating the possibility that defenders would be forced to surrender due to thirst, even if they could repel further attacks. The relief operation launched to assist Plei became a separate battle that demonstrated the challenges facing conventional forces operating in jungle terrain. The 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile, was assigned to break through enemy forces surrounding the camp, but their helicopters faced intense anti-aircraft fire from concealed positions. Enemy forces had positioned .51 caliber machine guns and other heavy weapons along the flight routes typically used by American aircraft, turning routine supply missions into running battles.
Project Sigma, another specialized Special Forces unit, was assigned to conduct reconnaissance missions in support of the relief operation. Sigma teams were inserted by helicopter into areas surrounding Plei to locate enemy positions and gather intelligence about their strength and dispositions. These teams operated under conditions of extreme danger, knowing that they were vastly outnumbered and that enemy forces were actively searching for them. Sergeant First Class Jerry Shriver led one of the most successful Sigma teams operating during this period. Shriver had already completed 2 tours in Vietnam and had developed an almost legendary reputation for his ability to operate behind enemy lines. His team specialized in what were euphemistically called direct action missions, operations designed to capture enemy personnel, destroy supply caches, and eliminate high-value targets. Shriver's methods were unorthodox even by Special Forces standards. He often operated in areas that other teams considered too dangerous, staying behind enemy lines for weeks at a time while gathering intelligence and conducting raids against enemy installations. His success rate was extraordinary, but his operations also highlighted the extreme risks faced by Special Forces soldiers operating in isolation from conventional support. The broader strategic context of Special Forces operations was shaped by the political complexities of the Vietnam War. The CIDG Program was designed to demonstrate American support for South Vietnamese independence while building relationships with ethnic minorities who had been marginalized by the Saigon government. But this created contradictions that became more apparent as the war escalated. Bom Inul, the raid chief who had been instrumental in establishing the first CIDG camp, became increasingly concerned about the long-term intentions of both American and South Vietnamese authorities. He understood that the war would eventually end and that tribal peoples would have to live with whatever political arrangements emerged from the conflict. His support for American forces was based on promises of autonomy and protection that might not be honored by future governments. The formation of FULRO, or the Front Uni de Lutte des Races Opprimées, in September 1964, reflected growing tensions between tribal groups and the South Vietnamese government. FULRO was organized as a political movement advocating for tribal autonomy and rights, but it also had military capabilities that could potentially be turned against either communist or government forces. American Special Forces found themselves in the difficult position of working with tribal leaders who had their own political agenda that might conflict with American strategic objectives. These political complexities became more pronounced as American involvement in Vietnam escalated. The arrival of conventional American combat units in 1965 changed the strategic environment in which Special Forces operated. Conventional forces focused on conventional objectives, controlling territory, destroying enemy forces, and achieving measurable tactical results, often had little understanding of the relationship-building approach that characterized successful Special Forces operations. The Battle of Ia Drang in November 1965 marked a turning point in how the Vietnam War would be fought. This engagement between the 1st Cavalry Division and North Vietnamese forces demonstrated that large conventional American units could successfully engage and defeat enemy forces in direct combat. But it also led to strategic decisions that emphasized conventional warfare approaches over the unconventional methods that had characterized early Special Forces operations. As conventional forces took responsibility for larger areas of South Vietnam, the mission of Special Forces camps began to change. Instead of serving as independent intelligence gathering and training centers, many camps were integrated into conventional military operations designed to support broader strategic objectives. This reduced their effectiveness in the relationship-building and intelligence-gathering roles that had made them valuable, while exposing them to larger enemy forces that conventional tactics were better equipped to handle.
The Tet Offensive in January 1968
demonstrated that despite years of special forces operations and conventional military success, Communist forces retains the capability to conduct coordinated attacks throughout South Vietnam. Many special forces camps came under attack during this period, and the tribal fighters, trained through the CIDG program, played important roles in defending their positions. But the strategic impact of these tactical successes was limited by larger political and military factors beyond the control of individual special forces units. Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Ladd, who commanded Special Forces operations in 2 Corps during the height of the CIDG program, understood the limitations facing his units. Despite tactical successes in training tribal fighters, gathering intelligence, and disrupting enemy operations, Special Forces could not resolve the fundamental political issues that drove the conflict. Military methods alone, no matter how skillfully applied, could not create the political stability necessary for long-term success. The gradual phase-out of the CIDG program began in 1969 as part of the broader Vietnamization policy designed to transfer responsibility for the war to South Vietnamese forces. Special Forces camps were turned over to South Vietnamese Special Forces, while tribal fighters were integrated into conventional South Vietnamese military units or local defense forces. This transition was often problematic, since the personal relationships that had made CIDG operations effective could not be easily transferred to new commanders who lacked the cultural knowledge and language skills of their American predecessors. Many Montagnard fighters who had served with American Special Forces faced uncertain futures as American involvement decreased. They had committed themselves and their families to supporting American and South Vietnamese forces against communist insurgents, making them targets for retaliation once American protection was no longer available. Some were relocated to refugee camps, while others attempted to continue resistance operations without external support. The fall of Saigon in April 1975 marked the end of American involvement in Vietnam, but the consequences for tribal peoples who had supported American forces continued long after the last American helicopter departed from the embassy roof. Many faced persecution, forced relocation, or worse under the communist government that now controlled all of Vietnam. The promises of autonomy and protection that had motivated their cooperation with American forces were forgotten in the larger political settlement that ended the war. For the American soldiers who had served with Special Forces in Vietnam, the experience remained a defining part of their military careers and personal identities. They had been part of an experiment in warfare that pushed the boundaries of traditional military doctrine, operating in conditions that tested every aspect of their training and character. They had formed relationships with indigenous fighters that transcended cultural and language barriers, sharing dangers and hardships that created bonds of mutual respect and trust. The tactical innovations and operational concepts developed during Special Forces operations in Vietnam would influence American military doctrine for decades. The emphasis on language training, cultural awareness, and relationship building became standard elements of Special Forces training. Techniques for long-range reconnaissance, unconventional warfare, and foreign internal defense were refined and institutionalized for future conflicts. But the Vietnam experience also demonstrated the limitations of military solutions to complex political problems. The most skillful tactical operations could not overcome strategic contradictions or resolve fundamental disagreements about political objectives. The relationships built between American soldiers and tribal fighters, despite their personal significance, could not survive larger political forces that were beyond the control of individual military units.
The legacy of Special Forces operations in Vietnam continues to influence American military thinking about irregular warfare, cultural engagement, and the use of indigenous forces in foreign conflicts. The lessons learned about the importance of understanding local conditions, building trust with local populations, and adapting military methods to unique cultural and political environments remain relevant to contemporary military operations around the world. The story of the Green Berets in Vietnam is ultimately a story about courage, adaptation, and the human capacity to form meaningful relationships across cultural boundaries under the most challenging circumstances. It demonstrates both the potential and the limitations of military force when applied to complex political problems, and it honors the sacrifice and dedication of soldiers who served with distinction in one of the most difficult conflicts in American history.